Good morning, everyone. At the start of a yet another new day here. It's about 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. Hope everyone's doing good. This is Jason Dean at Film Fanatic. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate all the support things have been getting. The videos have been getting a lot more views. I did a special on Thanksgiving about my favorite movie of all time, The Godfather, and it was really cool how it reached a couple thousand people within a couple of days or so. So I really appreciate people checking out the video, and just more folks are kind of chiming in, leaving comments. So I appreciate that. I love the dialogue when that can happen with folks out there on the World Wide Web. So really appreciate that. It's a deep thing. That's why I do this, to basically showcase all these movies that I love, but then also to just interact with people who I don't know, I kind of consider fellow film fanatics to a degree. So I really appreciate that. And so cheers. And people might not notice, but I got this coffee mug this year for my birthday from my great friend Nikki, and it's Bull Moose Music. They're pretty much responsible for all of the movies that I cover. Virtually all the movies that I do on the show were all purchased at Bull Moose. So it's a great thing, and it's a great place. So if you get a chance, if you're ever in Mid-Coast, Maine, and if you're a person who doesn't really do the whole streaming thing or digital service routine that most people use, it's a pretty awesome place, and it's amazing that business has been around for as long as it has been, and they continue to do great work, and they continue to be really successful, and they haven't closed any of their stores. They have multiple locations, so it's pretty awesome. So cheers to Blue Moose. So yeah, I today's show is going to be centered on the amazing, one of the greatest, easily one of the greatest slasher horror exploitation movies ever to grace the big screen, and to ever grace the this new, just amazing, like, kind of golden era that we're living in, with all of these reissues of all of these classic slasher movies, and that is Sleepaway Camp. I bought this last year. This was a movie I saw a bunch of times back in the day of the VHS years, and I bought this last year on Blu-ray. And damn, this movie is so good. It's easily, out of the top slasher films, and I feel like what movies that I equate to the '80s, or that are to a degree like the epitome of the '80s slasher exploitation world. This is definitely one of them. I mean, it's such a classic. It's also a huge franchise. It spawned about four other movies after this, and it's amazing how well it holds up. It feels like it could have come out in 2022. It's such a great movie. It's such a great ride. It came out in 1983. It was directed by Robert Hiltzik. And this Blu-ray edition is pretty awesome. Like I said, I got this last year, and this was put out by Shout Factory. And Shout Factory is one of those companies that has been, one of many that has started off this kind of renaissance of all things horror and all things related to the exploitation world. There's a whole bunch of companies. Blue Underground is another one that I really love a lot. I have bought quite a few movies through Blue Underground. Blue Underground is run by Bill Leswig, who, in his own right, is one of my favorite film directors. I did a video of Maniac a few months ago, and that's probably my favorite slasher film of all time. He's also done Maniac Cop and a whole bunch of other movies, but he's just like a legendary filmmaker. He kind of stopped making movies in the like early 90s for the most part. And then within the last five, I think it's like the last 5 or 10 years, he started his own company, Blue Underground. And kind of evolved to almost this thing of where I've seen lots of interviews with him over the years, and the notion of like paying it forward, where he basically dug deep in the vaults with his finances and started reissuing all of these movies, a lot of Lucio Fulci movies, all these obscure horror exploitation movies, movies that he felt really influenced him. All these like unearthed gems that were like kind of brought back to life through a lot of these companies, and especially Blue Underground, his company. They really, I personally think that they might be my favorite company or slash distributor as far as this amazing time that we're living in, where all of these films are being reissued and just getting like this just amazing treatment. Even these 4K releases, which is just insane. All these movies that were at one point had success and had their time, but then they kind of went into total obscurity. And a lot of films that were part of that whole explosion that were really obscure and didn't really get an audience. But now with all of these companies emerging the last few years, they're getting kind of their just rewards, and it's and a lot of the filmmakers are getting a lot more interest. They're doing conventions now, and they're suddenly realizing that there's a lot of people, a lot of film fanatics like me that love these films, and they kind of view these things as gold. So they have this new found level of success much later after a lot of these films have come out, and it's amazing. And all the time and love that they put into a lot of these packages is just incredible. And then the interview segments, they have hours. Typically, a lot of these Blu-rays and 4K releases have hours of in-depth, interviews and commentary tracks and just all of this, amazing content. They also the transfer, just from a technical side, where a lot of these films are transferred from like the original film, the original negative, which is a really intense process, and the way that they're able to show these films, and they still have that grit, they still have that grungy kind of aspect to them, but to see them where they're completely remastered with the picture, the visual element, and also the soundtracks being remastered is just phenomenal. I bought a lot of Lucio Fulci movies that Blue Underground has put out over the last few years. And I've talked a lot about Lucio Fulci being my favorite Italian director, but just fabulous, fabulous time. There's Blue Underground, Shout Factory, Severn's another company, Mondo Macabro is another one that I really, really love. They really specialize in pretty heavy duty content as far as stuff that's real deep dive, considered can be considered like the real deep dive aspect of the world of grindhouse and exploitation. They specialize a lot in a lot of really obscure movies. I've bought a lot of films put out by that company. They're probably my second favorite. There's so many, and it's wonderful, and the prices are great. They keep the prices pretty low. The quality is just amazing, and if it's something that you're into, like I am, with collecting a lot of these films and buying them, and then also watching them, on a regular basis, where they're not just bought and kind of put away or put in stored away. There's a whole wealth of knowledge to learn about how a lot of these weird movies were made, and it's super super fascinating, and it just kind of fuels the passion for seeking out more and more of these films, and it's led to me also discovering lots of film directors and other films because during the 70s, the decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were so many films that came out because it was, the time of the exploitation world. So there were a lot of copycats, and there was always like those hits that commercially were successful. Films like The Exorcist, or films like Jaws, for instance. They were definitely horror movies, but they were commercial box office hits. So that spewed on all of these imitations, through the Italian market, European market, and the American market. And they typically have these incredibly low budgets, and they're knockoff movies, but there's something about them that they're special, and they are kind of homages and kind of rip-offs, but they're also really bad and terrible in some ways, but they're just also onto themselves. I just think they're great. They're just great forms of pure escapism. And this movie came out, like I said, in 1983. This was a huge hit. There's a really awesome interview with Robert Hiltzik, the director of this film, and he basically talks about the whole kind of mindset of filmmakers of that time, of the exploitation world, because horror, and he talks a lot about during that time in the 80s, the whole slasher craze was full on. It was massive, and it was just sweeping the world as far as movies that were making some money, but they also had this huge rabid fan base. So Robert Hiltzik clearly says in this interview where he clearly wanted to make an exploitation movie and try to like capitalize on this movement, and he wasn't sure going into it how long it would last, and and a lot of it was really riding on the distribution of certain films, and if you could get your name out there and get good distribution through certain companies, you might be able to leave your mark. But this was one of those movies that at that time was one of the biggest successes and one of the biggest success stories. The interviews on here are fabulous with all the cast and crew. Felissa Rose and Jonathan Thurston. Just really, really in depth. And they talk to these actors and actresses where they didn't necessarily have a career after these films, as far as after this movie, as far as continuing their lives as in the film industry. Some of them did, obviously, but they always they always continuously say in these interviews how they look back at this period as being such a special period in cinema, and it built them and gave them their life, and they were able to make a career almost off of these few movies, or this one movie into itself. And pretty special, pretty special. During that time of the 80s, this was like shortly after the first Friday the 13th movie, so that was a huge craze. That franchise is obviously, like I've said before, I've done a show on that entire franchise. That's probably my favorite slasher franchise. But other slasher movies that came out during that period that were huge and that were I consider to be like my favorites. Maniac, like I mentioned, Bill Luswig's amazing masterpiece. Mad Men was another amazing movie. Just so many great films. New Year's Evil was another film that I did a video on a few months ago. Just so many great movies that My Bloody Valentine, which I just did a show on. So that was like a golden era, and every now and then there's a film that comes out, a more modern take on it, a film that's like like one instance, for one example, I feel that I've talked a lot about, and I've done a show on it also, is X, Ty West's movie X. Very much harkens back to this period of filmmaking, but done in a very contemporary way, and not in a way where it's not necessarily like a ripoff or trying to be something. It definitely has an influence from this, this golden era and this golden period. And like it's amazing too with the perspective that you get from a lot of the people that were involved with this film. It was during the time when there was no CGI. There was, everything was centered on practical effects, where everything was in camera and everything that you saw was really transpiring and happening, and more or less done in real time. And there's a real magic to that. I feel for myself. There's it just when I see a lot of effects, particularly during the 80s decade and also in the 70s, when I see like horror movies during that period, particularly, especially around the slasher period, and I see some really good kills, I'm always fascinated by, and it always makes my brain go off on these tangents of like thinking how are these things done, because it's basically these guys building these things for a real time scenario. They're using their pure imagination. They're not using any kind of software. It was way before the age of anything digital. So it has a certain magical quality to it, how they were able to pull these things off. And also given the restrictions that they had on their budgets, so they weren't, through the companies that a lot of these films were made, they were not, able, and they didn't really have time on their side as far as like the big budget, and they could sit and do numerous takes, of certain scenes. They had to get things right pretty much from the get-go. A lot of the times with one or two takes. So there's a certain urgency to that, I think, with that aspect that made a lot of these films truly memorable and kind of and also iconic, because it's there's a limitation to where they were going, and they were just using their skills purely from their own imagination, and with the obvious limitations of not being able to do all of these takes, and or being able to go back to the film months later and use various forms of CGI to maybe enhance the story, or to add to certain fight scenes or battle scenes and whatnot. There's a certain magic to that. Like one example that, and I do love certain films that use CGI. One of the examples that I've talked about before, where I feel like it was really successful and it's beautiful as far as examples of like more modern CGI usage. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies, the first three. I feel like those three films in particular, not so much the last three, but the first three films that he directed, those films are really perfect examples of using technology at your disposal to where it kind of augments a story. And watching those films now, and those films have actually been out for quite a few years now, but watching those films then, I remember seeing them in the theater, and then recently watching those films, last year or so. It's amazing how it holds up. It's seamless, and it has it's the lines are blurred as far as what is real and what is not. And also with those films, there were a lot of practical effects. There's actually lots of extras dressed up in costumes, and there's actual real locations. So it's a great and wonderful balance of all of those things. And also given that those films were put out by a major company, New Line Cinema. So financially there was a huge resource, but there's a great balance of practical and also CGI. And a film like that, obviously, that is the classic Tolkien story. You obviously the quality and the scope of it is going to be, or it needs to be, on a real grand scale. So, but I think that's like a perfect example of the usage of the digital world meets practical effects. I've talked about when I did my show, I did my interview segment with my great friend Emmett Layler. We did a show where we did coverage of mostly everything was centered on Stephen King and his books and adaptations, but we also talked about other things, obviously related to horror. But that was one of the examples of that, of it being, of CGI, more or less modern CGI, being blended so well with kind of the old school way of using practical effects. And one bad example that I can name, and it's a film that I just recently saw. I kind of liked it when growing up. I remember seeing it when it came out in the theater, and it always reminded me of Raiders of the Lost Ark to a degree, like a just a great classic kind of adventure story, with elements of mystery and magic and horror and action and romance. Was Brendan Fraser's The Mummy. And when I used to work at the teen center, I've worked with kids for a long time. I worked for a long time at the teen center here in Camden, and I still work with kids now. I work at the Montessori school. But back then, that was a movie. One of the things that we used to do a lot was watch movies with kids, and the kids were always big fans of the Lord of the Rings films, and also the Harry Potter films, which I really love also. Another, I think, great example of just really great a great usage of CGI in a modern context. But one of the other films that was popular was The Mummy by Brendan Fraser, and I recently bought that the other day on Blu-ray. I'd only seen it on DVD, and I remember seeing it in the theater, and I couldn't get through it. I watched it the other night, and I couldn't get through more than half hour of it. The CGI was just I felt was horrible. It looked really bad, looked really dated, and it looked artificial. And I think that that's unfortunately a trend a lot of the times with more modern, epic kind of films that have this epic, or at least what the filmmakers try to do. They try to create this epic lens and try to have this grand scale, have everything put out on this grand scale level with this huge budget. And I feel like that movie is an example where it's really bad CGI. Everything else isn't really there. There's not really a great story. The script is not very good. The acting's not very good. The concept is kind of interesting. It's got some things that are still cool, but it's so marred down, I feel, by the CGI, and everything is artificial. Like there's a scene in the very beginning of the film where it's obviously they're trying to tell the origins of how uh, you know, these series of events happened in ancient Egypt, and it just clearly looks artificial and kind of terrible and off-putting, and it's so hard to immerse yourself in the story, at least from my perspective. So I couldn't watch it anymore. That to me is a really good example of where it doesn't work. And the other thing about these great movies, even though they're obviously it's a very different kind of a thing, with like a movie like Sleepaway Camp, it's actually they actually used a real camp where it was all shot, and I feel like it's the ultimate. Aside from the Friday 13th movies, you really get a sense of this was these are real kids in this movie, and this is a real it's very real life. It's a real life scenario, and all the actors in it are kids, and they're playing themselves at their own age, and so you just feel like you're seeing something that is real and that it's based in reality. The other thing that's hilarious, like the kills in this movie are really great. I mean, just really top notch. I think some of the best practical effects that I've seen, and especially for a slasher film, just tremendous. And again, it goes back to what I said before. And it's a testimony for their imagination and the level of 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 skill that they put into a lot of these practical effects, because they did not have very much of a budget. And this film is known for unbelievably shocking ending of, in this movie has that. I think most people hear about this movie because of the ending of this film, and it's and I feel like it totally lives up to all the hype around it. Like I watched this again last night, and I've seen this movie, a bunch of times, and it's one of my favorites. And even watching it last night, I remember sitting on my couch, just being like, "Oh my god!" Like, because it's so shocking, and there's a few images around the last, few minutes of the film where it's really incredibly it's so incredibly creepy and scary, like legitimately, and just so kind of off-putting and just disturbing and weird and bizarre. And you don't, and I know the storyline for this film. Like again, it's one of my favorite films, so I know. But every time I watch it and you get to the climax of the film, it's always like, ugh, God, like that's just frightening. And I feel like it's one of one of the greatest payoffs and one of the best like surprise endings ever in film. Even with someone like me who knows this film pretty well and knows the story and has seen it many times, it still has that impact every time I see it. And it's this movie's got this real like sleazy element, and it's also like it's a really funny movie too, because all the kids are basically playing themselves, and there's certain characters, and the kids are being kids, so they're, they the dialogue is hilarious, and the where the kids are screaming and ranting at each other, and they're dropping f-bombs, and they're just like saying every obscenity that they can possibly think of, and it's hilarious. And it's amazing to think that they got away with making a film that, where you essentially have these underage kids, and they're, using words like cocksucker and motherfucker and just, left and right. And it's just like totally hilarious, because they're not, the director, uh, Robert Hiltzik, said that, in the past when they've made movies where they, or in certain films, they'll hire kids that are, or hire actors that are essentially older, or that are like more or less adults, to play kids. They look younger. But what he said out, he wanted there to be a level of authenticity to this film where it feels like a camp. They're real kids. They're in a real camp, and they're real kids doing real kid things. So he went out of his way to hire kids basically to play themselves. So it gave it this level. So it would give it this level of realism, and it totally works, because you literally, that's what you feel is happening, and that's what you're seeing. But but the dialogue and the amount of cursing, and the rants that they go on, it's and that they get into the whole kind of bullying aspect, and how kids can be really cruel and vicious to each other. They really go into that, but the dialogue is just super hilarious and super funny, and it's kind of like amazing that they were able to get away with having more or less these underage kids use language like that. Like it's like every other word is you know super over the top and just ridiculous and hilarious. And there's a couple of characters, one in particular who is like the chef or the cook of the camp, and he's essentially a real disgusting character, like completely disgusting, and he's a pedophile, and it's super disgusting and gross, and he gets what he deserves in the film. The other thing that's so cool is that you have, at least from my perspective, watching this movie, you have such empathy for the killer until, and you don't really know. You have a sense, at least even watching this now after I've seen it so many times, you get a sense of like, oh, okay, it's gonna be the killer who is responsible for all these acts is either going to be these two characters, but then it's really not. And then when you get to the end, like a shocking kind of you know outing of who it actually is. But all the people that get killed in this film, you you have, well, for me, you have total sympathy and empathy for why this killer is going on this rampage, and all the characters in their own weird way, particularly around the few, particularly around the cook or the chef in the film, who's this like disgusting pedophile. You really want to see them die. You really you do care about them, and you're invested. Like all the characters, like I'm invested in them. But all the people that do get killed, you want to see them die so badly, and so it's like this. It's kind of justified, and so it's a unique slasher film that way, where there isn't there really with certain other films, obviously like other movies that I've mentioned, you have empathy towards the characters, but you're not necessarily like a film like Maniac. You're not there's not really any point or any parts in that movie where I really identify with the characters. I really have empathy towards them, and I care about what's going to happen to them. But at no point, like say for Maniac, do I believe that that woman, should have been massacred, or do I have empathy for where the killer's coming from? I don't really. You can see I have empathy to try to understand where he's coming from, or I'm open to understanding that, but I never. For those characters that do get slaughtered, I never like. Well, I never come to the conclusion where that's justified, because the narrative is very different. But with this, it's like a revenge movie, and that the mindset's very different, where you're like, oh, that's great that happened, because that person was a piece of garbage and they kind of deserved, they were asking for it. So it's a very interesting narrative and characterization that's used on the screen for a slasher film, but just amazing, great music. And easily one of the most probably influential movies of its time. I feel like in the canon of classic slasher exploitation movies, this is definitely one of them. Definitely one on my top 5 list. The Blu-ray transfer is amazing. I mean, I love the artwork. It's so fabulous. The special features are just amazing. It comes with two discs. There's a DVD and also a Blu-ray. And the bonus special features are just fabulous. They have all these great interviews with all the cast, and like a really cool retrospective on the film, and they really talk a lot about that whole decade of exploitation horror in the 70s and 80s, and how this whole thing came about. And yeah, it's just such a classic. It's if you're a fan of horror, like this is one of the classics, a definitive masterpiece in that realm. Everybody who considers themselves to be a fan of horror, got to see this movie, because it's just such a classic. So yeah, can't say enough good things about this movie. 1983 was a good year. So this is Jason Dean. So thanks again for your support, and we will see you next time. Have a great day. Peace.